Welcome to The Explainer. If you're trying to get to the absolute core of some really complex political dynamics, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're unpacking a fascinating breakdown from the Glenn Beck Show featuring political data analyst Stu. We're going to look at how highly specific local voting mechanics, intense legal fights over state maps, and shifting everyday voter sentiments are all bubbling up to completely influence national polling. It's a lot, but it's incredibly insightful.
And that brings us to the big question for today's Explainer. How exactly are redistricting battles and local polls shaping broader election predictions? It is so easy to get lost in the sheer noise of a national election. But the source material makes a really compelling case that to truly understand the macro-level picture, you've got to look at the micro-level mechanics first. So we're going to examine the ground-level data, from courtrooms down in the South all the way to mayoral debates in Los Angeles, and see exactly how those localized events build into the much larger national narrative.
To do that efficiently, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the redistricting battles in states. Second, measuring changing voter sentiments. Third, California's unique political races. And finally, national polling and projections.
Okay, let's dive right into Section 1, redistricting battles in states. Before a single vote is even cast, the map has to be drawn. The Supreme Court's ruling in Louisiana is a textbook example of how fierce these map battles get. The source details a prolonged push by Democrats to expand the Voter Rights Act to create more majority-minority districts. But when this practice in Louisiana was challenged and went all the way up to the Supreme Court, the ruling drew a very specific line in the sand. As the source explains it, the court ruled that while you can use race as one ingredient in the recipe of redistricting, you absolutely cannot draw voting lines strictly based on race. You can use almost any other metric, but creating districts purely based on skin color was a no-go. The source argues this ruling could literally result in a significant shift of seats from Democrats to Republicans across the South as these maps are forced to be redrawn.
And this brilliantly illustrates how local constitutional rules can completely upend political strategies, this time over in Virginia. The source outlines a scenario where left-leaning politicians attempted to change voting line rules right before an election. Now, in Virginia, doing this constitutionally requires a strict sequence. First, a legislative vote, then a vote by the public to approve it. The analysis says politicians pushed this through right before the election to maximize their advantage. But there was a massive catch with that third step. Because early voting had been open for so long, Republicans pointed out that 40% of the population had already cast their ballots before these new rules were finalized. The Virginia Supreme Court stepped in and agreed the rules had been bent too far because the election was already heavily underway. The source points out that this mechanical failure allowed Republicans to gain more seats, which fundamentally changed the tenor of the race.
Moving right along to Section 2, measuring changing voter sentiment. We've looked at the legal mechanics, so what is actually driving the mood of the voters on the ground?
Well, the source notes a potential and frankly major cultural shift happening within the electorate right now. The hosts discuss how the so-called peak woke era, which they kind of pinned to movements around 2021 and 2022, really appears to be receding. Their analysis suggests that voters, even some left-leaning ones, are just growing tired of extreme partisan rhetoric and are now primarily seeking what they call rational governance. The big takeaway here is that the source sees voters waking up and simply wanting sane, everyday common-sense solutions instead of highly polarizing political theater.
And let's be honest, nothing brings voters back to common-sense realities faster than their wallets. Take a figure like $4 to $6. The hosts emphasize that when everyday life issues hit this hard, specifically pointing to $4 to $6 gas prices, the political landscape becomes incredibly treacherous for whichever party happens to be in power. As the analyst notes, historically speaking, it is exceptionally rare and incredibly difficult for any incumbent party to win an election when everyday costs are that high. This economic reality is just a massive headwind, forcing voters to look right past the media personalities and focus strictly on how the current economy feels to them personally.
All right, let's pivot to Section 3, California's unique political races. How do these shifting sentiments actually play out in one of the most famously blue states in the country? Let's zoom in on the West Coast.
The source spends a good chunk of time breaking down the Los Angeles mayor race, specifically zeroing in on Republican candidate Spencer Pratt. Talk about an uphill battle. LA is a heavily Democratic base. Donald Trump lost to Kamala Harris there 70-26. Yet, the source argues Pratt is actually running a highly effective common-sense campaign with incredible contrasting ads. He's highlighting his opponent's massive mansions while showing his own home, which is literally a trailer after his house tragically burned down. Because of the overwhelming Democratic majority, Pratt's only mathematical path to victory is razor thin. He absolutely needs the left-leaning vote to fracture perfectly between his two opponents. He's banking on a split vote scenario, something like him getting 37% and his opponents getting 30% and 28%, which would allow him to just squeak by.
So, the crucial question is, can Pratt actually trigger that fracture? Well, according to the prediction market cited by the source, a recent debate may have done exactly that. During this debate, the candidate who was previously the favorite, an Ivy League-educated woman, had such a disastrous performance that her chances of winning plummeted by a staggering 40 percentage points in the prediction markets. To put the sheer magnitude of that collapse into perspective, the hosts reminded the audience that after Joe Biden's heavily criticized debate performance, he dropped by 15 percentage points. A 40-point drop is catastrophic, and it suddenly makes Pratt's narrow split-vote path look like a genuine mathematical possibility.
And it's not just Pratt making waves out in California. The source also highlights Steve Hilton, pointing out his ability to bridge the gap and appeal to sensible voters across the aisle. During a debate, when he was attacked on the issue of immigration, Hilton delivered this really striking response. "I'm the only one up here who is an immigrant. That's who I am. I'm the only one who has any credibility on this particular issue." The hosts argue that this kind of direct, lived experience common sense just cuts right through traditional partisan lines. It appeals even to left-leaning voters who might not agree with all of Hilton's conservative policies, but they deeply respect his straightforward credibility.
Which brings us to our final segment, Section 4, National Polling and Projections. We've seen how these mechanics and sentiments operate on the local and state levels, so let's step back and look at the macro picture.
Let's look at the data the source uses to analyze the national GOP landscape. In this recent Atlas Intel poll mapping potential national figures, Marco Rubio holds a commanding lead at 45%. J.D. Vance is trailing but still significant at 29%. Ron DeSantis sits at 11%, with 10% basically saying none of the above. But what really matters here isn't just the raw numbers, but the underlying public perception that is driving these numbers, which the hosts eagerly unpacked.
The source provides this really fascinating contrast of how these two leading men are defining themselves in the eyes of the electorate. J.D. Vance at 29% is viewed as the candidate who is staunchly anti-war and highly focused on uprooting systemic fraud, which appeals to a very specific, mobilized segment of the voter base. On the flip side, Marco Rubio, leading at 45%, is perceived entirely differently. The hosts describe Rubio as rock solid, incredibly competent, and deeply patriotic in almost an old-timey way. In a political climate that is just filled with chaos, the source argues that Rubio's perception as quiet, stable, and completely normal is heavily resonating with an electorate that is just exhausted by constant extremes.
However, as any good data analyst will tell you, you always have to look under the hood of a poll. And the hosts pointed out a massive caveat regarding this specific Atlas Intel survey. When looking at the generic ballot metric within this very same poll, the sample size skewed heavily to the left. In fact, it was plus 14 points for Democrats. This is an incredibly vital piece of context.
So why does that plus 14 matter so much? Because, as the source concludes, a heavily left-wing sample size is going to naturally skew the results of a GOP poll. The hosts argue that a Democratic-leaning group is far more likely to prefer a candidate like Marco Rubio, who is perceived as stable and traditional, over a more disruptive, populist candidate like J.D. Vance. They equate it to how a right-wing sample might naturally prefer a moderate Democrat over someone on the far left. Therefore, while Rubio's lead is definitely notable, the source warns that the specific composition of this poll's audience heavily influenced that final 45 to 29% spread.
We've covered a lot today. We started with legal fights over local maps, moved through the harsh reality of gas prices, analyzed split vote strategies in LA, and saw exactly how demographic samples skew national polling. It's a stark reminder that macro results are absolutely always built on micro foundations. Thank you for joining us on The Explainer. Keep looking at the data, and we'll see you next time. But before you go, we want to leave you with this to think about. How will these granular, local mechanics ultimately converge on the national stage this November?